3. Next morning, Mr. Hanson informed him coldly of the necessity of punching the time clock at 7 every morning, and delivered him for instruction into the hands of a fellow worker, one Charlie Moore. Charlie was 26, with that faint musk of weakness hanging about him that is often mistaken for the scent of evil. It took no psychological examiner to decide that he had drifted into indulgence and laziness as casually as he had drifted into life, and was to drift out. He was pale, and his clothes stank of smoke. He enjoyed burlesque shows, billiards, and Robert service, and was always looking back upon his last intrigue or forward to his next one. In his youth his taste had run to loud ties, but now it seemed to have faded like his vitality, and was expressed in pale lilac four-in hands and indeterminate grey colours. Charlie was listlessly struggling that losing struggle against mental, moral, and physical anemia that takes place ceaselessly on the lower fringes of the middle classes. The first morning he stretched himself on a row of cereal cartons and carefully went over to the limitations of the Dlrympl G Wrng company. "It's a piker organization. My gosh, look at it! What they give me. I'm quitting in a couple of months. Hell, me stay with this bunch?" The Charlie Moores are always going to change jobs next month. They do, once or twice in their careers, after which they sit around comparing their last job with the present one, to the infinite disparagement of the latter. "What do you get?" asked Dlrympl curiously. "Me? I get 60. This rather defiantly. "Did you start at 60? "Me? No, I started at 35. He told me he'd put me on the road after I learned the stock. That's what he tells 'em all." "How long you been here?" asked Dlrympl with a sinking sensation. "Me? 4 years. My last year, too. You bet your boots." Dlrympl rather resented the presence of the store detective as he resented the time clock, and he came into contact with him almost immediately through the rule against smoking. This rule was a thorn in his side. He was accustomed to his 3 or 4 cigarettes in a morning, and after 3 days without it, he followed Charlie Moore by a circuitous route up a flight of back stairs to a little balcony where they indulged in peace. But this was not for long. One day, his second week, the detective met him in a nook of the stairs on his descent, and told him sternly that next time he'd be reported to Mr. Macy. Dlrympl felt like an errant schoolboy. Unpleasant facts came to his knowledge. There were cave dwellers in the basement who had worked there for 10 or 15 years at $60 a month, rolling barrels and carrying boxes through damp, cement-walled corridors, lost in that echoing half-darkness between 7 and 5:30, and, like himself, compelled several times a month to work until 9 at night. At the end of a month, he stood in line and received $40. He pawned a cigarette case and a pair of field glasses, and managed to live, to eat, sleep, and smoke. It was, however, a narrow scrape, as the ways and means of economy were a closed book to him, and the second month brought no increase. He voiced his alarm. "If you got a drag with old Macy, maybe he'll raise you," was Charlie's disheartening reply. "But he didn't raise me till I'd been here nearly 2 years. "Got to live," said Dlrympl simply. "I could get more pay as a laborer on the railroad, but golly, I want to feel I'm where there's a chance to get ahead." Charles shook his head skeptically, and Mr. Macy's answer next day was equally unsatisfactory. Dlrympl had gotten to the office just before closing time. "Mr. Macy, I'd like to speak with you." "Why, yes." The inhumorous smile appeared. The voice was faintly resentful. "I want to speak to you in regard to more salary." Mr. Macy nodded. "Well," he said doubtfully, "I don't know exactly what you're doing. I'll speak to Mr. Hanson." He knew exactly what Dlrympl was doing, and Dlrympl knew he knew. "I'm in the stockroom, and, sir, while I'm here, I'd like to ask you how much longer I'd have to stay there." "Why, I'm not sure exactly. Of course it takes some time to learn the stock." "You told me 2 months ago when I started." "Yes, well, I'll speak to Mr. Hanson." Dlrympl paused irresolutely. Dlrympl paused, irresolute. "Thank you, sir." Two days later, he again appeared in the office with the results of a count that had been asked for by Mr. Hess, the bookkeeper. Mr. Hess was engaged, and Dalrymple, waiting, began idly fingering in a ledger on the stenographer's desk. Half unconsciously, he turned a page and caught sight of his name. It was a salary list. Dalrymple, Deming, Donahue, Everett. His eyes stopped. Everett, $60. So Tom Everett, Macy's weak-chinned nephew, had started at 60, and in 3 weeks he'd been out of the packing room and into the office. So that was it. He was to sit and see man after man pushed over him, sons, cousins, sons of friends, irrespective of what their capabilities, while he was going to be cast for a pawn, with going on the road dangling before his eyes, put off with the stock remark, "I'll see, I'll look into it." At 40, perhaps, he would be a bookkeeper like old Hess, tired, listless, Hess with a dull routine for his stint, and a dull background of boarding-house conversation. This was a moment when a genie should have pressed into his hand the book for disillusioned young men. But the book had not been written. A great protest swelling into revolt surged up in him. Ideas half forgotten, chaotically perceived and assimilated, filled his mind. Get on. That was the rule of life, and that was all. How he did it didn't matter, but to be Hess or to Charlie Moore. "I won't," he cried aloud. The bookkeeper and the stenographers looked up in surprise. "What?" For a second Dalrymple started, then walked up to the desk. "Here's that data," he said brusquely. "I can't wait any longer." Mr. Hess's face expressed surprise. It didn't matter what he did, just so that he got out of this rut. In a dream, he stepped from the elevator into the stockroom and walked to an unused aisle, sat down on a box, covering his face with his hands. His brain was whirring with the frightful jar of discovering a platitude for himself. "I've got to get out of this," he said aloud, and then repeated, "I've got to get out." And he didn't mean only out of Macy's wholesale house. When he left at 5:30, it was pouring rain, but he struck off in the opposite direction from his boarding house, feeling in the first cool moisture that oozed soggily through his old suit, an odd exaltation and freshness. He wanted a world that was like walking through rain, even though he could not see far ahead of him. But fate had put him in the world of Mr. Macy's fetid storerooms and corridors. At first, merely the overwhelming need of change took him. Then half-plans began to formulate in his imagination. "I'll go east, to a big city, meet people, bigger people. People will help me. Interesting work somewhere. My God, there must be." With sickening truth, it occurred to him that his facility for meeting people was limited. Of all places, it was here in his own town that he should be known, was known, famous, before the water of oblivion had rolled over him. You had to cut corners, that was all. Pull, relationship, wealthy marriages. For several miles, the continued reiteration of this preoccupied him, and then he perceived that the rain had become thicker and more opaque in the heavy gray of twilight, and that the houses were falling away. The district of full blocks, then of big houses, then of scattered little ones, passed, and great sweeps of misty country opened out on both sides. It was hard walking here. The sidewalk had given place to dirt road, streaked with furious brown rivulets that splashed and squashed around his shoes. Cutting corners, the words began to fall apart, forming curious phrasings, little illuminated pieces of themselves. They resolved into sentences, each of which had a strangely familiar ring. Cutting corners meant rejecting the old childhood principles that success came from faithfulness to duty, that evil was necessarily punished or virtue necessarily rewarded, that honest poverty was happier than corrupt riches. It meant being hard. This phrase appealed to him, and he repeated it over and over. It had to do somehow with Mr. Macy and Charlie Moore, the attitudes, the methods of each of them. He stopped and felt his clothes. He was drenched to the skin. He looked about him, and, selecting a place in the fence where a tree sheltered it, perched himself there. In my credulous years, he thought, they told me that evil was a sort of dirty hue, just as definite as a soiled collar. But it seems to me that evil is only a matter of hard luck, or hereditary and environment, or being found out. It hides in the vacillations of dubs like Charlie Moore, as certainly as it does in the intolerance of Macy, and if it ever gets much more tangible, it becomes merely an arbitrary label to paste on the unpleasant things in other people's lives. In fact, he concluded, it isn't worth worrying over what's evil and what isn't. Good and evil aren't any standard to me, and they can be a devil of a bad hindrance when I want something. When I want something bad enough, common sense tells me to go and take it, and not to get caught. And then suddenly Dalrymple knew that what he had wanted first. He wanted $15 to pay his overdue board bill. With a furious energy, he jumped from the fence, whipped off his coat, and from its back lining cut out with his knife a piece of about 5 inches square. He made 2 holes near its edge, and then fixed it on his face, pulling his hat down to hold it in place. It flapped grotesquely, and then dampened and clung to his forehead and cheeks. Now the twilight had merged to dripping dusk, black as pitch. He began to walk quickly back towards town, not wanting to remove the mask, but watching the road with difficulty through the jagged eye holes. He was not conscious of any nervousness. The only tension was caused by a desire to do the thing as soon as possible. He reached the first sidewalk, continued on until he saw a hedge far from any lamppost, and turned in behind it. Within a minute he heard several series of footsteps. He waited. It was a woman, and he held his breath until she passed. Then a man, a laborer. The next passer, he felt, would be what he wanted. The laborer's footfalls died far up the drenched street. Other steps grew nearer, grew suddenly louder. Dalrymple braced himself. "Put up your hands!" The man stopped, uttered an absurd little grunt, and thrust pudgy arms skyward. Dalrymple went through the waistcoat. "Now, you shrimp," he said, settling his hand suggestively on his own hip. "You run, and stamp loud. If I hear your feet stop, I'll put a shot in you." Then he stood there in sudden uncontrollable laughter as audibly frightened footsteps scurried away into the night. After a moment he thrust the roll of bills into his pocket, snatched off his mask, and running quickly across the street, darted down an alley.